Hello and welcome to Kentuckians for Energy Democracy's Utility Regulation in Kentucky webinar series. Today is our second webinar in the series, co-hosted with RMI, and the topic is how regulators can support large load forecasting. We're really excited to have with us today Jeffrey Sword and John Wilson as our experts on this topic. Kentuckians for Energy Democracy is a statewide network of organizations working at the intersection of energy affordability, utility accountability, and the transition to a clean, safe, reliable, and resilient energy system. And we're really excited about today's webinar topic because the topic of large load and data centers coming to Kentucky has been a really hot issue lately. And so we're excited to dig into this topic a little bit more with our experts today to learn how we can be preparing for large load forecasting from our utilities. Our first expert today is going to be John D. Wilson. John Wilson is a vice president at Grid Strategies. Pertinent to today's discussion, John is the lead author of Grid Strategies' 2023 report, The Era of Flat Power Demand is Over, and its 2024 report, Strategic Industry Surging, each of which presented a national overview of trends in load growth and challenges to forecasting and responding to those trends. John is also lead author of Making the Most of the Power Plant Market, Best Practices for All Source Electric Generation Procurement, which he co-authored in 2020 with former Colorado PUC Chairman Ron Lear and two others. John's main focus is state energy regulation. With 18 years of experience in utility regulation, John consults for consumer advocates, state commissioners, trade associations, and advocacy organizations. John is a resident of Lexington, Kentucky. Our second presenter is Jeffrey Sword. Jeffrey is a senior associate in RMI's carbon-free electricity program. He develops open source models that assess the risks associated with decarbonization pathways to ensure a fair allocation of costs and benefits. He also works towards assessing climate-related financial risks. He is interested in probabilistic forecasting, grid modeling, and spatial allocation issues. Prior to joining RMI, Jeff completed his PhD at Cornell University, where he built modeling tools to aid wind and solar integration. In terms of spatial modeling, he conducted several studies on siting utility-scale solar energy, including a review of the social aspects of solar development. The bulk of his later work focused on using statistical, data-driven methods to assess and enhance ensemble forecasts of solar and wind resources. Welcome, John and Jeffrey. We're so excited to have you here. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to John to get us started today.
Good afternoon, everyone, or I guess good morning if you're in the Central Time Zone. Happy to be with you all, and we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of reports that we put out. The most recent one was the August 2025 Strategic Industry Surging Report, and we updated that, December 2024 report, and we updated that in April 2025. So basically, this is a story about how we are seeing that the utilities forecast for electricity load growth has increased dramatically over the past several years. So in 2022, nationwide, the 5-year forecast for electricity load growth was 23 gigawatts. A gigawatt, for those who don't know, is about the size of like a large natural gas plant or maybe a typical coal plant. And that was a pretty typical level of load growth forecast that we had seen over the past few decades, maybe a little high, but nothing extraordinary. And then in 2023, we saw that just really what everyone considered at the time explode to 39 gigawatts. And we put out a report describing this, got a lot of national attention. And then 2024 said, hold my beer. And we saw that grow to 67 gigawatts. And then from the time we issued the report to when we updated it in April, we had an additional total, the total grew to 120 gigawatts. So these are very large numbers, lots of power demand, lots of transmission projects, and just a lot of effort and work on the part of utilities and other associated power industry players. And so I'm going to try to talk a little bit about what's behind these numbers, so that you have a little bit of a better understanding of what the discussion is about. And so just to put that in context, from a percentage perspective, what we're seeing is not that high compared to historical benchmarks. So in 2024, our average annual load growth forecast was 2.8% per year for the next 5 years. And you can see that that is less than we actually experienced in the 1980s and much less than we experienced prior to the 1980s. So from a percentage point of view, it's not that large of a increase. What the challenge is that over the past 4 decades, we've seen lower levels of growth. And that means that the supply chains and the utility capacity to build new transmission lines, new power plants, whatever the type, has been, at that level. So all of the industries and the support personnel are sort of scaled to less than 1% per year on average growth. And now we've suddenly nearly tripled that to 2.8%. And so we're looking at, a real challenge there in terms of um, how that growth can be managed by these institutions. What's driving that load? Here's a sample of utilities across the country, and regions like PJM, which covers part of the Kentucky. And so data centers are present in almost every single load forecast we look at that has substantial load growth. We also see manufacturing in some of them and electrification in some others. And again, this is focused on the 5 year time frame. If you look out 10 years, you see more load forecasts that include electrification as a major factor. So somewhere around 2030, you see electrification really start to kick in as a big driver of load across the country. Where is this load mostly concentrated? So the two top regions of the country are ERCOT, which is now forecasting 47 gigawatts of load growth over 5 years, and PJM, which is now forecasting 25 gigawatts of load over 5 years. The next group is the Pacific Northwest, SPP in the middle of the country, MISO in the Midwest, and Georgia Power in the Southeast. And this is all as of several months ago. We're starting to hear large numbers from some other places in the country. So it sort of started out as very much a regional phenomenon, made mainly in the Virginia, Pennsylvania region, and also down in Texas. And now it has expanded to the regions you see highlighted in this map, and it's soon going to be growing even further than that. Here's a table, and you can download this from our firm's website if you want to take a look at it in detail. But this basically lays out sort of the construction of these forecasts, and I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail. On the left, you see highlighted in red the 4 regions where we updated our initial 2024 survey of this back in April, and so we just updated 4 of them, and so all the numbers in red are what was updated. And these are the official planning forecasts from these regions, and so we've got illustrated on here the peak demand by year for 2029. So back in 2022, we were forecasting 840 gigawatts in 2029. And then by 2029, by 2024, that same forecast for 2029 had grown to 880, and then we added another 53 megawatts with these updates that are in red. So, and you can see that in one case, the update went down, not up. That would be MISO. So that's kind of how this all comes together as we're looking at these forecasts from the utilities. We're not judging them or assessing them in this analysis. Let me pause there and see if there's any quick questions, just anyone lost as to what we're talking about with load forecast and these kind of numbers. I'm going to get into what's behind them next. Okay, not hearing anything, and I don't see the chat anymore for some reason. So if there's chat, somebody could call my attention to that. That'd be great. Um, So here's what's kind of driving that. Over on the right, I've illustrated the utility forecast. That's what we've been talking about so far. And so you see there that the vast majority of it is data centers, and then you see manufacturing and electrification. These are kind of my personal estimates. Many of the forecasts do not break down the large loads that they are forecasting into these categories. And so we have to infer from various documents kind of approximately what portion of the load forecast falls into each category. But it is definitely well over half data centers. And by data centers, we're including a wide range of facilities. So it could be a company's private, a very large company's private data center for internal purposes only. It could be something that you're familiar with, like Amazon Web Services, which provide services to a number of companies to run their own software. Could be, of course, AI gets a lot of attention. That's a small fraction of that right now, but is included in a substantial way in this forecast. And of course, cryptocurrency facilities would also be another type of data center. So we didn't break it down into those subcategories because we really don't have the data there to do that. I mean, it's kind of shocking actually how little information we have about what's coming. And so forth. Over on the left, I have the tech industry summaries. And what you see here, I've got it kind of shaded because there's a range of numbers that you get from people in the tech industry. But probably the most credible numbers are somewhere in the 50 gigawatt range. And what this means is the tech industry is saying that over 5 years, the most we could realistically build in the US is probably around 50 gigawatts. So that's a big difference from the roughly 80 gigawatts I have on the right that's from the utility forecast. And there's several different reasons for that. The most important one is, or the one that gets the most attention, is that some of these companies that are trying to build data centers are proposing to build multiple facilities across the country, and they're probably not actually capable of building all of the facilities that they're proposing to build. So the simplest thing might be to examine Microsoft. Microsoft might have 10 data centers under development right now across the country, and they might realistically only expect to build 8 of them. So we don't know which 8. So each utility includes that data center in its forecast in some way, perhaps. And then, you see that you're overcounting a little bit. Another thing is just schedule slippage. The data center goes to the utility and says, we want to build this by 2028. But realistically, some of them are going to slip a year, 2 years, 3 years. And so they really belong maybe in the 2030 or 2031 forecast. So those are a couple of examples of the way that these forecasts can diverge from, what's each company is asking each utility for that's building up that utility forecast and what's actually feasible and possible from an industry point of view. Let's turn now to building and transportation electrification impacts. So these are coming. We are seeing them grow. I've got here an example from NISO, New York. And in this case, you see that in 2023, building electrification, which is blue, was a very small component of winter peak and was not even visible on summer peak. And then you see it's growing here, not so much in the summer, but in the winter. But the system itself is still a summer peaking system. Um, so all the way up until roughly 2035, building electrification has almost no impact on the load forecast in New York. Once when the system switches to winter peaking around 2035, the biggest component of the driver there is no longer electric vehicles, but is actually building electrification. And so you see there that in New York, building electrification will appear to have a sudden impact on the peak, but of course it's been building over a decade or more. So building electrification is a big driver in New York. It's going to be different from region to region exactly what the drivers are. But this is something we're really seeing as a 2030s phenomenon just because of the scale up of electrification programs. How big could some of these data centers be? So this is an example from the Indiana and Michigan power utility, and their current forecast doesn't even show data centers as being a factor. That's here on the left, and all of these colors are other kinds of industries. And then on the right, you see this big green area, which is over half of it. That is their longer term. It's longer than 5 years, maybe 10 years. I'm not sure exactly how many years. And they're saying that once these hyperscalers that they're talking to are built out, that could be more than half of their revenues. So the utility is switching from a utility that serves a very diverse portfolio of users to a utility that serves residential and especially hyperscalers and a bunch of other people sort of as sidebars. So it's a really big transformation institutionally. Um, so another thing that you should know about large loads is that they can have a lot of challenges for managing the system that are not present from existing loads. So the NERC, which is the national organization that manages reliable power, is doing a study of this, and they've identified three categories of effects that these large loads can have. One is price response, and you see that illustrated here on the right, where as prices go up in Texas on the grid for power, the crypto mining facility can essentially turn off in almost an instant, and then it can turn right back on. And this can create problems for the utility in managing the response of its generation on the system. So that kind of fluctuation is very new and challenging for the power industry. Fortunately, it hasn't caused significant problems yet, but there's a lot of investigation to this. A second problem is what's called ride through. So if you can imagine that if lightning strikes a transmission line, that can cause a voltage fluctuation in that transmission line. And that voltage fluctuation is dangerous to a data center. And so the backup power systems can kick in immediately upon detecting this voltage fluctuation and take the large load effectively off the grid instantaneously and continue to run the large load using the backup power systems. But you've got now a second disturbance to the grid in that you've got a load that's dropped off the grid right after this lightning strike. So that can be a challenge. And the third thing is sort of normal operations. You can have, especially with AI, some of the training models can really vary the load at the data center very rapidly over just a few seconds. So how are utilities managing all of this uncertainty? So this is an example from PJM, which serves part of Kentucky. And on the left is the electricity demand growth as it's changed over the years. And you can see the rapid escalation in 2020, 2024, and 2025. And one of the things that people sort of assume is that, these forecasts include and the word gets tossed around a lot, speculative project that might be out there. And so, two guys in a truck with a real estate license come in and say, we're going to build a data center. And so all of a sudden that load goes into the forecast. And that is categorically not the case anywhere in the country. What is happening is that there is sometimes some load associated with prospective loads in there. But what happens is that you start out with the wires utility, the utility that the customer is going to connect to, like on the right, there you see AEP, and they have built out their forecast based on their opinion as to what load is going to come in. And then PJM is actually coming in on top of that and adjusting that load even further downward based on its opinion about what could happen regionally. And it's a complicated process that I probably don't have time to get into. But these adjustments are being made. And still, we are seeing the difference that I showed you earlier between what the data center industry is hoping to build and what is realistically possible according to tech industry sources. So there's a lot of adjustments being made, but it's still not enough. Here's an example of how one region does these adjustments. And again, I'm not going to go into all the details, but they have taken data and they make reductions and delays to what is being proposed um, by the company that wants to interconnect. And you see on the left, there's actually, it says TSP provided. What that means is the transmission owner has assessed the project and has determined that it is a realistic project and that they believe in the numbers that they're submitting. So they are submitting those numbers. And then ERCOT, the regional authority in Texas, is making all of these additional adjustments to come up with its load. And if you remember back from the earliest slide, Texas was the place with still the largest forecast load. So that very large load you see in Texas is not all of the projects that people say they want to build. It is the number that results from all of these filters, and you still get that large number. So you can imagine what it started with. And I've heard that, a total number that comes in sort of on the front end is somewhere in the 200 to 300 gigawatt range. So it is a very large reduction from start to finish. I'll finally mention that I have a role in leading a national study on load forecasting for something called the Energy Systems Integration Group. And they have a large load task force, and I'm heading one of the teams on that, which is looking at load forecasting. So I just wanted to share that in terms of the kind of engagement that I'm involved in. And that pretty much covers what I was hoping to present. Any quick clarifying questions for anything that I covered a little too rapidly and people would like to catch me up on? Otherwise, I think we'll save the sort of discussion type questions for later. Okay, I'm not hearing anything, and it said I'm not able to see the chat anymore. So thank you
I'm
very
not seeing
much.
anything in the chat right now. Thanks so much, John.
Great.
We'll hand it over to Jeffrey. I think, there we go. Perfect.
Awesome. Thanks for that, John. I'm going to go sort of like hopefully a little bit more into detail regionally in the region of Kentucky, that is, and hopefully give you all some ideas about how you might interrogate load forecasts with the ultimate goal of validating them and improving them. So just to provide a little bit more or a couple more opinions to some of the ones that John shared. Um, at least IEA and BNEF are still showing pretty clearly when you look over that long term that load growth is greater than just data centers. That's incredibly true globally, but even in the US, you kind of notice that BNEF through 2035 really shows data centers as maybe a third of the picture, with electric vehicles still being very important. And so the takeaway here is that there's a lot of opinions floating out there. It's going to take a couple of years before we know what reality is. And so hopefully our forecasting processes can kind of like back this up and get more accurate over time. The other thing I want to mention briefly is that while we've seen growth rates this big before, I think the type of load that we're seeing is a little bit unique. And so, especially for the 4 decades, a lot of the things we were talking about were sort of happening more at this distribution connected levels, and especially in the last few years with like residential electrification and EVs, like the distribution system has been the ground where that has played out. With data centers, you really care about what the transmission system is doing and what the transmission constraints might be. So that's a little bit of a shift. To show a little bit of a complementary view to the map that John showed earlier, this is sort of like an individual utility, how individual utility growth rates have changed over time. And so when we started tracking utility IRPs in early, like January of 2021, they were projecting a 6% growth through 2035. As of March of this year, we're up to 22%. A lot of this is data centers, of course. But the other thing I'll note is the top line there is IEA's net zero energy scenario, and we're still well below that trajectory. The flip side of this story is that we also have a lot of evidence that utilities have overforecasted load, especially in the last, let's say, 20 years. This um, line chart on the left here shows the forecast error between 2026 and, 2006 and 2023. Um, for forecasts of duration from 1 to 10 years. And what you'll notice is that on average, utilities have overforecast in their 10-year forecast by 17% over this period. So there's clearly some improvements to be made just in the forecasting piece. What this is primarily translated in sort of like today is more gas and utility plans. And that's sort of illustrated. You can see that with the red arrow there. And we're seeing this kind of like despite supply chain challenges that are becoming more and more front of mind for folks. And we're also seeing sort of like, or the other thing showing up in this graph is that wind and solar additions are running up against interconnection queues and these same supply chain challenges. So you're seeing that curve, wind and solar in March 2025 shift to the right as those express themselves and make their way into utility plans. Haven't seen that for gas yet. Sort of remains to be seen whether or not that will show up. So the last couple slides have been essentially a mixed message, right? You're seeing massive amounts of load projected, but also a lot of evidence showing that the utilities have overforecast historically. And so that sort of just brings us back around to this essential question behind utility planning, which is how much is essential? Like how much new capacity is actually essential? And I'm going to sort of walk through some ways that outline how like last century's forecast methods are really not cutting it anymore and how we might transition into a place of future and more advanced forecasting. So just first off, like why do we actually care? Over forecasting and under forecasting carry certain risks. The biggest risks of under forecasting are reliability. Nobody wants uh, to be on the hook or blamed for those events where you have to turn the power off because you don't have enough capacity. That sort of cuts across both the customer, the regulator, and the utilities motivations. More on sort of like the utility and state policy motivation is economic development, like especially for data centers. Like if you don't have capacity available and you can't make it available in the next few years, like chances are those customers are going to go elsewhere. Um, as we've also seen, and we're seeing today, the primary risk to over forecasting is affordability. So if you end up building more infrastructure than you need, you end up paying more than you otherwise would. And that has become relatively unpopular. And so we've created this framework for how you could update a forecasting process, not just like the individual algorithm that the utility wants to use to create whatever they think their future load is going to be, but sort of like the whole process that surrounds that. And it hangs on these three principles, which are thorough, up to date, and validated. And so by thorough, we kind of mean like you need to spend time understanding how AI loads are different than cloud computing load and how data center loads are different from the historical loads in your territory. Validated, I think this is actually sort of the biggest learning edge for a lot of utilities. validation hasn't been as like standard of a practice, by virtue of the fact that um, most utilities are over forecasting. And so if we can set up processes by which um, either regulators, third parties, or utilities themselves sort of like check how well they did on last year's 5 years ago forecast and make changes based on that to drive down their error over time. Like that's really what we're talking about here. And finally, up to date. A lot of these forecasting processes are pretty complicated already. They have a lot of moving parts. And so by the time they make it into like sort of an official document or a proceeding, they might be a year, 18 months out of date. There might be a couple of different vintages used for different things. And so just like ensuring consistency and updating things regularly could sort of at least make sure that like all of the infrastructure on the table is sort of like compared apples to apples rather than a bunch of different things. So really our summary here is load growth is sort of this triple challenge. And it is uh, good to take a minute to appreciate that like economic development, affordability, and reliability are the three pillars of this system that we're trying to disentangle. And it's a difficult challenge because if you pull too hard towards one side, people representing the other side will not be super happy. I'm going to go into the next section of examples from our sort of Southeast lookalike utilities, let's say, um, who have recently overhauled their forecasting practices, and we might have things to learn from them. I'm also going to preface this by acknowledging that a lot of you are going to have greater experience on the specifics of the forecasting processes in Kentucky. And given that we have active proceedings, I'm going to keep comments pretty high level about that, but would be happy to follow up afterwards if you have more specifics. First off, the IOU perspective. So the purpose of this discussion, LG&E KU, projects electricity using an econometric model. This is, I would say, a pretty industry standard. Lots of utilities do this. And then for their large load customers, large load forecast, they engage in direct consultation with the largest customers to essentially vet what their econometric model is providing them. And again, this is like pretty industry standard, not novel by any means. But if it's working, if it's accurate to the degree that you have set, then there's nothing sort of like explicitly wrong with this process. I'm going to offer some anecdotes from Georgia Power's large load forecast, particularly because Georgia, rather than saying this is necessarily a best practice, like I don't consider this necessarily a best practice, but I think it's indicative of where forecasting processes are going. And this is an emergent and improving process. Um, so I guess a little bit of background. The Georgia Service Commission directed Georgia Power to create this large load pipeline a couple of years ago. And in that pipeline, they have to track individual information about large loads, and then they update and publish this forecast quarterly. So this example I'm showing here of the forecast is derived from the Q4 of 2024 forecast. The projects that go into this pipeline are categorized into stages. The stages are listed here. Contract for service, request for service, technical review. And Georgia Power assigns a range of probabilities based on sort of like their best judgment about like where these projects are and how likely they are to actually get built. And then they run a stochastic or probabilistic simulation to generate a bunch of different forecast futures, and they take the middle one essentially, and that's what you see here. The thing I'll draw your attention to immediately is that the technical review bucket is by far the largest contributor to this forecast, especially once you get 5 years out. The contract for service and the request for service areas are much more modest, especially if you compare that to Georgia Power's all-time peak demand. And so really where we're looking for uncertainty is in these projects that are under technical review. So to dive like a little bit more deeply into their process to kind of like understand what this means, we can look at what they're actually doing in their forecast. So number one, they essentially, as I said, assign realization probabilities to each project in their pipeline. That ends up being kind of this complicated, like 5 different factors of things where they're trying to capture whether or not Georgia is chosen as the location for the project, whether or not Georgia Power is chosen as the electric service provider, and whether or not a project reaches commercial operation after a contract has been signed. They're also providing sort of like distributions. These are made up distributions. The real distributions are, of course, private. For metered versus contracted peak, a lot of discussion around that these days, and a likely construction delay. So the point is that the inputs that Georgia Power ultimately decides on for these like fundamentally impacts what their end forecast is going to be. And so this is where it becomes really important to like, yes, they have this great and pretty forward-looking methodology for actually producing their forecast. Indeed, like the North Carolina Utilities Commission has pointed out that like they view this as industry leading and would like Duke to pursue something similar. But what we're missing here is still sort of like this validation piece. And without that, it's sort of hard to tell how good the forecast actually is. Advanced algorithm doesn't equal a good forecast necessarily. I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about co-ops, particularly because especially for the data center loads, a lot of the co-ops are small enough that they've been a little bit more nimble in kind of like attracting these large loads and have been innovative in kind of updating their processes accordingly. And so I put up this overview of EKPC's forecast. Obviously high level. In the short term, they look at large commercial sales projections based on the input of their members. Their development staff, economic development staff might provide input if they have better input. And then in the long term, EKPC forecasts new large loads using some sort of regression-based approach driven by economic variables. I'll sort of like note that this doesn't seem that dissimilar, sort of like in theory to me, than what, say, Georgia Power is doing. They're just setting a lot of their assumptions as sort of like fixed variables, whereas Georgia Power is sort of like taken a step forward and like maybe put a distribution on top of this and maybe changed or added a couple factors. But you can kind of see that like methodologically, at least this is going in a similar direction. The case study I'm going to present here is for the Northern Virginia Electric Cooperative, or NOVEC. They of course, located in Northern Virginia, have thought a lot about this for actually multiple decades now, and have kind of shaped a lot of the thinking in this sort of like broader space. John mentioned e-cig, about how a best practice might look like. And the thing that's, I would say, the most different about what Novec is doing is that their first phase is essentially the identification step. And that identification step is just intimately linked with their sort of just overall contracting process for a large load. And so that's what I'm showing here. This is sort of like their public version of this that they share with PJM to try to convince PJM not to like downgrade their load forecast. And so the important pieces here is that in this initial feasibility study, the customer has already provided this non-refundable deposit. And so, sort of like in one brush, they are reducing what one might call speculative load because each step in this process requires financial commitment and reducing risk to customers because Novec isn't going out and procuring uh, infrastructure before they're certain that that infrastructure is going to be paid for. Um, the other thing that's distinctly different about them is granularity. And so this is a picture of their load forecast. You'll notice it doesn't look that different than the other ones you've probably seen, at least when it's aggregated to this. Like the shape is the same, whatever, the numbers are different. But there are a couple of like key differences. The first of which is only projects that are actively working their way through the development queue are included. And so like while they might not make exactly which step or like exactly the criteria of like including the data center in their forecast like public, um, like they know that. And it's sort of like provides confidence, sort of going up that chain that John was talking about earlier, all the way up to the RTO, that like this is actually a trustworthy forecast. And so that's something that I think would be interesting to kind of like take away and replicate in more places across the country. The second major difference is that they produce building level forecasts. That might not mean a lot to you, but essentially, data centers are getting so large that like a data center used to fit in a building. Then it sort of evolved to this like maybe there's a couple of buildings, and now there are like campuses where there are like clusters of buildings, and like the number of megawatts are in some cases hundreds of megawatts, up to like gigawatt scale, are like like exist within these sort of like massive data center campuses. And so Novec's ability to kind of like drill down into this individual building level forecast is actually quite unique. They're thinking of this more of sort of like a city rather than kind of like an individual customer. And I think that's kind of key given that some of these larger campuses are essentially city in size. um, they're predicting individual utilization rates, meter demand over Quincy capacity, but you'll notice that like a lot of their kind of like methodologies sound somewhat similar. Like they're using calendar variables, they're using weather variables. The other thing they're doing well is they're using historical variables, but pinning it to like individual buildings if they have historical data for that building. They're using similar campuses if they have multiple customers with, or the same customer with multiple campuses. And so all of these things reduce the uncertainty in their like actual forecast. And I think they have some early evidence that like this is producing a meaningful improvement. And then of course, when they aggregate it up, it looks the same. But point is that they have access to that more granular and even probabilistic data if they want it. And just to kind of like summarize all of this, like updating or creating a tariff for large loads can reduce some of this uncertainty and mitigate risk. Um, like asking for something in a contract can provide that downstream certainty is essentially what we're saying. And especially for things like load shape, flexibility, ramping parameters, like if you can get those out and don't have to like guess at what those are, like your forecast is going to be more accurate in the long term. And I think with that, it looks like there's a couple of questions in the chat that I have not actually looked at yet.
Great, thank you. The first question is from Sarah. It says, how would we be able to get approval of third parties to test forecasts to ensure that they aren't over forecasted? That would include approval via the PSC or utilities, correct? A good thought, but our utilities here would definitely push back on this. Can you talk a little bit about how you can use third parties to test forecasts?
Yeah, I'm curious for John's opinions as well, but I think the national labs could be a good like intermediary to kind of test this with. I know at least I think I think LBNL and PNNL have been tracking this space like fairly closely and are looking for additional ways to engage. And so like if I was going to provide kind of like I would say like um the ideal case of like who might actually be a trustworthy party to like hold a national level forecast, that's probably where I would look first. But I'll also know there's like a bunch of consulting companies around the country that like put out forecasts. And I think both John and I have used some of their plots. And so at least to kind of like benchmark maybe more narratively than actually kind of like how close are you to like this person's opinion of this or not uh, could gain some
So
traction.
would that mean that they would either have to get approval from the utilities or the PSC to do this, or is this something completely separate to where the information they come out with in the a case docket, somebody third party can go in there and look and see if the forecasts are correct or
So
a
maybe
normal
I can
thing?
address that since I work in a number of states as an expert witness on these kind of proceedings. I'm, you know, I have put in comments on load forecasts. It's not particularly my specialty, so when there's a high degree of issues with a load forecast, we usually will contract with somebody else who's more specialized in that area. But basically, the graph that Jeff put up with showing that there's sort of been this upward bias in utility load forecasts, most of that has been driven by sort of the historically the main part of the load forecast, which would be like residential, small business, maybe even middle, medium, and large businesses, and not these large loads. And those are usually done with what's called an econometric analysis. So you'll take economic data, housing data, other kinds of data. It varies from place to place exactly what's considered. And that's used to historically look at how those things related to the load and then project forward. And they've been over biased, in my opinion, because they haven't taken into account structural changes in the economy and in energy efficiency. So that's been the major problem there. The challenge with benchmarking large load forecasts is that these new loads are particularly new in character. And so it is very difficult to hold a utility accountable for getting something wrong when, you know, no one in the industry really knows for certain how to forecast these. And so that's the real challenge. I think it would be very challenging to get a authoritative, nationally based load forecast that could be applied down to the utility level. We have had those discussions with the national labs as part of the ESIG project I'm on, and it's just even focusing just on data centers and not on all the other sources of load growth, it'd be difficult or impossible to do that.